9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio.
Hello and welcome to a special Thanksgiving edition of DSR. I'm DJR, I'm David Rothkopf, I'm your host, and I'm joined by two of our enduring favorites here, Rosa Brooks of Georgetown University Law Center. How are you doing, Rosa?
Great, David.
Great. That's fantastic. And Edward Luce of the Financial Times. How are you doing, Ed?
Suppurating with exuberance.
Suppurating with exuberance?
Isn't that what a...
Simmering. Let me correct my...
Right. Separating.
Isn't it like a wound
pus.
suppurates?
No, you can't have pus expressing exuberance. You're right. Just suffused with exuberance.
It's so hard to find the right words for this moment, isn't it?
Yes.
It really is. But on the other hand, Ed has an English accent, so everything he says sounds so intelligent.
It sounds better. It does sound better.
It does, even if he says something completely nonsensical like suppurate.
I will use suppurating correctly at an unexpected point during this podcast.
I can't wait. So let's discuss open wounds. Ed, what's the thing that bothers you the most about an open wound?
Well, it's the pus, obviously the pus.
Well, what's the pus? What does the pus do in the wound, Ed?
Well, isn't it? I don't know what pus does. I just know it's really horrible.
In fact,
for fuck's sake! It suppurates, Ed.
No,
it suppurates.
Stop
Sorry.
Cleaning
No, I'm sorry, both Rosa and David. I disagree. It oozes. It doesn't suppurate. I don't know where you came up with that. It oozes.
Ed, you introduced this metaphor, but I would like to say that it is my understanding that the pus is the byproduct of things like lots of white blood cells and collagen formation. It is the process of a wound healing.
That's beautiful.
So it's a good sign, actually.
Up to a point.
Well, that's so perfect way to start us off on a Thanksgiving podcast. One of the things Rosa is obviously happy for and thankful for is pus. Now, Ed, you wrote an entire column today, which was the most un-Rosa-like column I ever saw. It was kind of, I'm looking for the good news about Donald Trump. Donald Trump being elected, it just makes Ed all tingly. Why, Ed?
Well, first of all, it doesn't. Let me just make that clear. I guess, the point of what I was writing about is the unexpected effects of Trump's transactionalism on various conflicts around the world. And the fact that the real danger, I think, from Trump is at home. But, the Abraham Accords being extended to Saudi Arabia is, I think, likelier under Trump than it would have been under a President Harris. And the Abraham Accords, Saudi-Israel normalization would be perhaps the last best, even if it's a slim hope, for having some kind of settlement for Palestinians and a sort of drawing of a line under the Israel-Palestine tragedy for the time being. That's not a great hope, but I think it's probably a more realistic one, given the affinities between the House of Trump and the House of Saud, than it would have been, with Blinken on his sort of endless Middle East tour and usually fruitless one. I'm not criticizing Blinken, but I just did not feel any dynamic for upside or surprise in the Middle East with the Biden-Harris administration and the continuity of that under Harris. So I think it's reasonable to expect that some of the Trump transactionalisms, and that could also apply in Ukraine, I underline the word could, that he wants a deal, Putin doesn't want a deal. What's the quickest way Trump can get to a deal? Well, Biden has given him leverage. He's given ATACMS range. He's given Storm Shadow range. And it might be that, he will be better able to secure some concessions from Putin. not predicting this. I'm saying Trump could surprise us on the upside globally on one or two of those kinds of issues. On China, I really don't know what he believes, and I don't think he knows what he believes. He can change his mind on a dime. That's a potentially extremely dangerous sort of capriciousness that Trump has, but it's also potentially, a deal-making one. So all I'm saying is don't be surprised if we are surprised by Trump's effect on what is a very unstable, volatile international situation, and it could be an extremely bad effect.
Well, okay. Rosa, since Ed wrote this article, Donald Trump has appointed as his Ukraine envoy General Keith Kellogg, not the brightest light on Broadway, 80 years old, a man who has in the recent past written an article saying if the U.S. gives any more aid to Ukraine, it should be conditioned on Ukraine negotiating with Russia, which sort of tips the hand. I'm providing that as a kind of an update for folks who aren't following this. What do you think of Ed's thesis?
I agree with Ed's thesis. And let me add another data point to Ed's thesis. One of the few things that people seem pretty confident of when they talk about Trump and his psychology is that he's genuinely terrified of the prospect of nuclear war, that it really scares him. And people who know him seem to believe that this is something that is true and deep about him, that he finds it terrifying. And I think that we saw in his first administration that he made a lot of bellicose noises, but every single time when there was anything that could have led to further escalations, he then backed down rather quickly. He lost interest. And that may stem from his genuine and perfectly appropriate fear of nuclear annihilation. That's a wild card. I understand all the arguments about the importance of nuclear deterrence, but I also think that many of the biggest nuclear hawks who believe most strongly in the idea of nuclear deterrence are probably kidding themselves about the degree to which they understand and can control the dynamics of escalation and deterrence. And so Trump's very fears may actually help keep us out of trouble in some ways. That's a possibility. I think he means it when he says he wants peace because he is scared of nuclear conflict. And again, that's not an inappropriate thing to be scared of, obviously. So I think it's not completely impossible that his anxieties about possible escalation will lead him to favor paths that reduce tensions and reduce conflict. That's totally possible. That being said, as Ed said, he's Donald Trump. The other great thing that we know about Donald Trump is that he doesn't really have any coherent ideology. He is a creature of his own whims. He agrees with whoever is sucking up to him at that exact moment. So I don't think anybody can have any particular confidence that there will be a steady through line of anything whatsoever in his foreign policy. And it's equally possible that through bellicose rhetoric and general stupidity and stupid economic policies and so on, he will end up doing something that makes the world more unstable. So I don't. And certainly at a minimum, I don't think the Ukrainians are going to end up feeling terribly happy about what happens next. It may be that their choices aren't so great anyway, with or without Donald Trump. But yeah, and obviously the tariffs announcement the other day, which should not have come as a surprise to anyone, since he had been broadcasting that throughout his campaign, but it nonetheless seems to have been a real shock to the Mexicans, the Canadians, et cetera, who I think didn't quite believe him. Thought that was just a sort of pandering to his base. Well, now he's been elected. He seems quite likely to do exactly what he says he's going to do. And I think that the shockwaves that is going to send through the global economy, not to speak of the domestic economy. I mean, and obviously for now, just putting aside all of the domestic cruelties and mayhem he's going to cause. I don't think any of our allies should expect a smooth ride. At a minimum, and actually, I think it's worth talking a little bit maybe in a minute about the impact that the likely domestic instability and chaos is going to have on the ability of either allies or adversaries to have any sort of coherent interlocutor in the United States.
Well, that doesn't sound like reasons I'm thankful Donald Trump is president to me.
Well, we're doing our best.
Well, and I'll give you a reason. Everybody's talking about Donald Trump as like a big fascist, and it's because he's like a big fascist. Also, he's a criminal. But, and here's the upside. He's greedy as hell, and it's
Yay.
quite possible. Yeah, and he's surrounded by greedy oligarchs. And if they're given a choice, they're probably going to feather their nests before they get bogged down in all this like stealing democracy shit, right? I mean, and particularly since he's not going to jail. So all the reasons he was kind of pissed off and wanted retribution, that's kind of gone. So he can really focus on cutting deals with people, getting his family richer, getting Elon richer, getting all these people. And kleptocracy is kind of the silver lining of Donald Trump, right? Because then we don't get fascism.
Yeah, I mean, you might need some fascist methods to defend this kleptocracy. I'm not sure the two are mutually exclusive.
Well, Trump doesn't need any because he's got immunity. He could he could walk to the Treasury and say, "I need $100 million for the interests of the United States official business. Please hand it over."
And if you don't, I will shoot you dead on Fifth Avenue.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Or he could equally, he could say to Seb Gorka, come out, so he could do a Saddam Hussein and say, just come out into the Rose Garden with me, pull the pistol from his holster and, fire him, literally. But all kinds of stuff the Supreme Court has given him full immunity to do. It is something that's, I think underexplored, the degree of affinity that the MAGA base feels with Trump's anti-war position. Now, I don't think Trump has got any moral qualms about anything. I think this is his market testing sort of way of doing politics. But there is a sort of deep, not quite isolationist, but not interventionist aversion in large sections of the American public, not exclusively the MAGA base, against boots on the ground. And it might be for the wrong reasons. And maybe they would have, the very same people would have been against boots on the ground in the Second World War. But he is, as it happens, kind of pledged to them as the non-war candidate.
And there's a strong camp on the left that feels the same way, obviously. And that's
but this is non-trivial, right? This is non-trivial. This is part of his brand.
So well, that's and that, by the way, is consistent with the America's First brand in the 1930s.
It is.
Which was isolationist and involved RFK Jr.'s grandfather. So there's even a genetic connection. Rosa, I'm just as we're talking about this, I just want to speculate for a moment. What do you think the first way that Trump is going to use his immunity? I mean, he's been given this gift by the Supreme Court. He literally is the one person in U.S. history who has entered a job with the Supreme Court having said, you can't commit a crime while you're on this job, so long as it's ostensibly as a consequence of official business.
Right. I mean, they didn't quite say you can do whatever you want. If Trump decided to just go on a serial killing spree, picking houses at random for no other reason than he felt like it, and shooting one out of every 3 people he runs into, that presumably would not be an official act.
However, if he said they were illegal immigrants and it was in his interest to do so,
well,
national
so we shall see, right? I mean, the Supreme Court did. The idea that a president would have immunity for official acts, that in and of itself is not novel, right? That indeed is the is consistent, broadly speaking, with international law, et cetera, up to a point. I mean, the point at which our Supreme Court broke with other jurisprudential traditions was in the broad way they understood the term official acts, and they viewed it as encompassing far more kinds of behavior than other courts have viewed it as encompassing. What does remain to be seen is how that will be. They didn't give a lot of detail, so what does remain to be seen is exactly how that will be interpreted, both by lower federal courts and by ultimately the Supreme Court itself, if it comes to that. So I don't think we should make the mistake of thinking that he does not have total immunity. He can't just do whatever he wants, and he can't magically convert. If he gets into a fight with someone in his family and decides he's going to kill them, he can't magically convert that crime into an official act simply by announcing, as he raises the gun, I hereby, on behalf of the United States, murder you because I'm mad at you and I don't like you, right? So anyway, that just thought I should.
What if he raises the gun and says, I hereby, on behalf of the United States, murder you, and if that doesn't work, I pardon myself?
Now that he could do, but probably, maybe, right? We don't know, uncharted waters. But no, I actually think it's important to keep reminding people that the Supreme Court did not give him total immunity for anything. That the phrase official acts has not been completely stripped of meaning, and as we go forward, it will be important for everyone to be highlighting the fact that not everything can be construed as an official act. I'm not going to answer your question, David, of what do I think he's most likely to do that is going to test this, because nobody has the slightest idea. And unfortunately, I would add that many of the most egregious things he has talked about doing are arguably legal. That there's a pretty large category of sort of lawful but awful things that we have to worry about, and part of this, and we've talked on this podcast for many years since we started the predecessor to this podcast during the Obama administration, and we've talked many times about the rise of executive power, the expansion of executive power, the concerns that I and many of us have voiced over many years about the logic underlying, so for instance, the Obama administration's rationale for drone strikes, which is very similar to the logic that underlay the Bush administration's rationale for indefinite detention and for the use of torture before the Obama administration. And the logic, the through line in all of these things has been, we don't need to ensure that there are checks and balances, even when we take someone's freedom away indefinitely without process, even when we take their life away without process. We don't need to have checks and balances from other branches of government, because you can trust us. We recognize this is an awesome power. We would only use it for good. Look what nice people we are. Look what voluntary constraints we've placed on our own actions to try to ensure that we do everything right. And I think many of us said over and over, not good enough. It's not about whether I trust you, but number one, even good people can make mistakes. But number two, we have no guarantee that there will always be good, responsible, careful people who have that power. It didn't make any difference. I think we saw a sort of continued expansion of those types of emergency and national security based powers under multiple presidential administrations of both parties. And now here we are to slightly misquote, to misquote Justice Jackson's decision from the 1940s. They've been lying around like a poisoned chalice, and they will be picked up by whoever wants to pick them up. And Trump is now picking up that particular poisoned chalice and is going to use it against the American people in exactly the ways that we were told for the last several decades. Oh, don't be ridiculous. We don't live under Putin. That's, our government would never turn these powers against Americans. And I think that is the situation that we're now in. We have now created a web of exceptional powers, that were intended to be used for genuine national emergencies and for national security purposes. but there are very, very few restrictions on those powers. I mean, forget the immunity. Why do you need immunity for if you're using a power that has been granted to you by the Congress of the United States, and that the Supreme Court, in some cases, in cases such as the Insurrection Act, has already said it's at the president's sole discretion how to use this power. So immunity doesn't even really enter into the picture. There's nothing to be given immunity from if he uses these powers. But doing things like deploying the U.S. military domestically, potentially to shut down lawful protests, for instance, would be a horrific thing to see in the United States of America. And it won't be illegal.
Well, see, Ed, that's another thing to be happy about. You know, he's not going to have to abuse the immunity because he has a lot of bad powers already. But let's try find something else here. I'm dedicated to finding positive things to say about the incoming administration because I want to obey in advance. I'm told that's what I'm supposed to do. What about his cabinet? Are there some people you're perfectly, okay, they're pretty good. That guy's not bad.
Well, I'm waiting to see whether he does appoint Kash Patel to head the FBI, and if
that would be good for you. You'd like that one?
It'd be a big upside. You know, the guy's clearly qualified. He's a very balanced individual, bears no grudges, and would, say no to his commander-in-chief, to his president, sure, whenever anything was even mildly inappropriately suggested by the White House.
Sure.
No, I mean, I don't know whether things are lawful or not lawful. I mean, Rosa's just given a very good overview of the fact that pretty much everything's lawful. So I'm worried about what he's going to do without knowing which side of the legal line it might fall.
Right.
And clearly, weaponizing, deploying, the military, or federalizing National Guards, Red State National Guard, to help with the deportation of millions of people is something that I think would, on a scale quite different to, settling scores with enemies in DC, with having them investigated by Kash Patel's people, had he got the FBI job, but it would be on a far greater scale, society changing. You would effectively have martial law in places. You would have horrific sort of scenes all over the country if this is something he seriously intends to do. And I think he seriously intends to begin doing it. And I very much hope, as you and I were discussing earlier, David, that the discipline of however the Dow Jones and the Treasury bond market responds to that might cause Trump to think twice. But I cannot see the nomination of Pete Hegseth and Pam Bondi, is actually in some ways worse than Matt Gaetz because she's got more of a patina of sort of competence and way more experience as a public attorney. And like Chris, Pete Hegseth has some real weird Christian nationalist ties. Extremely weird. And when that comes into it, that there is a loyalty to a higher being, however they define it. I mean, and that's not just Donald Trump. And that the law is just a secular sort of nuisance.
I'm with you. This falls directly into the category of I never want an airline pilot who believes in the afterlife.
Yeah,
it's just bad. It's not in your interest. Well, let me ask a question, Rosa. Speaking of what sort of you were getting at, what Ed's been getting at here, this week. What is his name? James Homan? What's it? Tom Homan? James
Tom Homan.
Tom Homan, who's kind of seems to me, and I don't know him personally, but he does seem kind of like a thug. Said that in response to the mayor of Denver saying, "I'm not letting those guys come in and round up people," he said, "I'm arresting the mayor of Denver." Can he do that?
The answer is it sort of depends, doesn't it? I mean, at the moment, the mayor of Denver has not committed any crimes, and it would, as we lawyers like to say, the question is too fact specific. We don't know the answer to that. There might be some circumstances in which the mayor of Denver if impeding a lawful federal act might be subject to arrest, but obviously at the moment,
But
no.
you just said all federal acts are lawful.
Well, yes, the devil's in the details. If they're clever, they will find ways to do everything within the scope of the law. And I think it's worth underscoring. We talk a lot about the rule of law and the importance of the rule of law. On the right, they often say, well, but it's not illegal, so it's totally consistent with the rule of law. And I think that the fundamental idea of the rule of law tends to be one that incorporates both some idea of procedural fairness, consistency, advance notice, treating people, equal protection, due process, but it also tends to incorporate some kind of idea of natural rights, right? Because go back to, for instance, Nazi Germany. Internal to Germany, the Holocaust was perfectly lawful, right? The Nazis just passed laws that said, and now here's the deal, everybody. You in fact, have to turn over the Jews, and we have to detain them. And look, oops, I guess we have to kill them. It's the law. So saying that something is lawful is not the same as saying either that it is consistent with any notion of basic human rights, or to say that it's even necessarily consistent with a more robust understanding of what the rule of law means. The Chinese often use a term that translates roughly as rule by law, which the United States over many years has consistently said, that's actually not the same thing. You can, especially in an autocracy, but also in a majoritarian democracy, laws will be passed that are profoundly immoral and profoundly destructive to any notion of human rights and freedoms. So not everything that is legal is okay. And I think that goes without saying and should go without saying. Here's let me give you a silver lining that sort of relates to your question about the mayor of Denver. Here's the one silver lining, in addition to the fact that they may be so greedy and kleptocratic that they never get around to the abuses they have been contemplating because they're just too busy stealing. If they try, and I believe they probably will, to go ahead, for instance, with mass scale roundups and deportations, they won't be able to do it, right? I mean, they'll be able to amp up detentions and deportations, maybe 5%, maybe 10%, maybe even 15 to 20%. But the scale that they're talking about, which is 10 to 15 million people, will prove to be impossible for simple logistical reasons, but also some legal reasons. The logistical reasons being that we don't know where those 10 to 15 million people are. We don't even necessarily know who they are, much less where they are. You have to, in order to round them up, detain them, and deport them, you have to know who they are. You have to find them. You have to have human beings who go and get them. And they're probably not that eager to be rounded up, so they're making it difficult. You have to have a way to transport them. You have to have a place to put them. You have to be able to feed them, et cetera, et cetera. You eventually have to deport them somewhere, which means you have to have some other country say, okay, fine, we'll take them. All of those things take money. They take staff. They take training. They take facilities. They take vehicles. They take all kinds of things that don't actually exist at this moment. And as the Nazis demonstrated, one can create an infrastructure in less time than one might think to inflict massive suffering on people. But it doesn't happen overnight, and I do believe that we have a vast. I don't think we are in Nazi Germany. We're in the United States of America. We do have institutions that have a pretty robust sense of legality and right and wrong, and you cannot turn all that stuff on a dime. I think you eventually, given time, if Trump can carry on for the next 15 years, given time, he could entirely subvert and destroy all of the institutions that do uphold the rule of law. But it's not something that he can do overnight. And one of the things we've talked about, the simulations that you and Ed both took part in, that were hosted by the Brennan Center through the Democracy Futures Project, trying to understand how a second Trump administration might unfold. And one of the things that we pretty consistently saw was that when the Trump administration in those simulations tried to do this sort of thing, they immediately encountered hundreds and then thousands of civil servants scratching their heads and saying, what? we can't do that. With what money, with what legal authorities, with what budgetary authorities, with what people, but those people aren't trained to do this. And besides, we need them over in some other place doing some other thing. And wait a minute, where are we going to get all those vehicles? And wait a minute, there's no place to put people. And wait a minute. And that did succeed. And that's not disobeying orders, by the way, to the extent that the military is being involved. That's asking perfectly rational questions about being given a tasking that is logistically impossible and makes no sense. Not to speak of issues for the military and the National Guard about things like, well, what are the rules of engagement? Are we shooting people? Because if we're shooting them when they're running away from us or something like that, well, that actually is against the law, and you might have immunity, we don't. We are still subject to state and local prosecution as well as federal prosecution. The president can't pardon someone for a state crime. And most criminal law is state level criminal law, not federal level in any case. So for all of those reasons in our simulations, they were able to sow a lot of misery in a lot of different communities and for a lot of different individuals, but they were not able to accomplish what they were trying to accomplish on a mass scale. And so I think that's the best I can do for you in terms of a silver lining.
Ed, I bet you can smell the turkey roasting. You've listened to Rosa talk, and you could smell the stuffing, the cranberry sauce, all wafting towards your nose, suppurating out of the turkey's carcass. And I bet.
Yeah,
sorry.
Turkey plus. I can't wait.
Yeah. But I bet you listen to that and you think, wow, that is good news. And so I will give you the last word here to respond to Rosa's excerpt from her class at Georgetown on the nature of constitutional law and how to abuse it. I think Rosa teaches that course. Right?
I'm fairly reassured by what Rosa has just said. This cannot be. I mean, I do think Elon Musk's understanding of the Constitution and of the federal government is a little bit less sophisticated than Rosa's. I think he just thinks you sort of get a magic wand and you saw his tweet. Let me read it out. This is from Elon Musk. Those who break the law will be arrested, and that includes mayors. And our friend Mehdi Hassan had a quite good riposte to that, which was nothing to see here. Just the world's richest man, technically still just a private citizen, threatening to arrest democratically elected officials. This is what oligarchy looks like. It's also what idiocy looks like. And Rosa has kind of persuaded me that, I already thought that Elon Musk is in this sphere, at least, an idiot. And he's Icarus. His wax wings are melting as we speak. He's way too close to the sun. But the real question here, to go back to the beginning of this podcast, is oligarchy. It's kleptocracy. It's plutocracy. That's the real change that we're seeing. Is Trump's sort of giving them. He's going to be good for their bottom line.
Well, so what we're thankful for here is greed. We're thankful for incompetence. We're thankful for idiocy. We're thankful for fear of nuclear war, which, as we've noted, is not a bad thing to fear. And we're thankful for the president's transactional impulses internationally. And so I think you've done your job. I think you have given each and every one of our listeners a whole host of things to be thankful for, a cornucopia of things to be thankful for on this, what we would call in Judaism, Erev Thanksgiving, the eve before the holiday. And so for that, I thank you, Ed, and I thank you, Rosa. And to all of you who are out there listening, now much happier than you were at the beginning of this podcast, we thank you for joining us. And we hope you'll join us again after Thanksgiving, after you've had a wonderful holiday, and we get back to work here in what is clearly going to be a great time for America. Until then, happy holiday, everybody. Bye-bye.